So, welcome. Good morning. I hold up my cup of coffee for you. Thank you for attending. And if you're watching this webinar because you registered and you couldn't make one of these times today, well, thank you for watching. This is how to launch your professional podcast without making these common mistakes. Thank you for the reaction also that I got when I did this webinar a couple of weeks ago with a desire to do it again. So there's two things I want to jump in with. When I talk about a professional podcast, what I mean by that, what I mean by it is I often say that it's a podcast that people would actually really want to listen to. But because I work with many professionals and people who own their own businesses, CEOs, thought leaders, the desire is to make a podcast that people would want to listen to. And you do that through going through some elements like making sure that the quality of your podcast sounds as good as everyone else, that there is a structure to listening to it. Because the other side of this, and you're going to learn this in a few minutes, is, and I think this is actually a good thing, well, I think there's good and bad to it, is that anyone can start a podcast. And you can start a podcast at the quality level of the biggest names in podcasting. But if all you do is hit record and start talking, then are you going to make a podcast that people want to listen to? I mean, there are people from my years in radio I know who just came into this earth who are just really good at telling a story, who are really good at talking. But for most of us, it requires thought process, preparation, structure. So that's a lot of what we're going to talk about today, of creating this professional podcast. And then the subtitle is without making these common mistakes. and just to add the second part to this is that instead of just making this webinar about here's the 7 or 8 common mistakes that I see people make, is I baked them into this webinar around what I'm going to refer to in a few minutes as like the 3 big secrets. And really what this is if you are armed with this information, then you can launch a podcast that is professional, that sounds quality at the same level as the biggest names in podcasting, and that quite frankly, people are going to want to listen to. So my goal with this, as I get into this, is to give you the confidence and the ease to create a podcast. Many people that I talk to, and I work, and I'll share with more in this in a moment, but I work with just a complete variety of industries. It's very rewarding work to know that I can work with somebody who might be in marketing or business, but I can also work with somebody who is a glass artist. One of my clients is one of the top 20 glass artists in the world. You'd see him if you walk down Main Street, USA at Walt Disney World, and everything in between. So I'm telling you, if this variety of humans can do it, then you can do it, no matter what your goal. And a lot of people come to me who are just interested in starting a podcast for their family. Awesome. You're going to see that you can do that. And a lot of people come to me, which again is really where this webinar falls, is, hey, I want to start a podcast for my business, for my brand. And that's when, if you have the confidence and you understand where that confidence comes from and that you can do it and that you do sound good, because many people can be the smartest people in the world, but you put a microphone in front of them and you tell them to tell their story, and it's like, oh, I can't. It's a classic case of the imposter syndrome comes up. So confidence and ease is my goal with this today. And it's my goal, as it will always be, for you to have the confidence to create a podcast that you're proud of and that people want to listen to. So I think it's important right now, whether you're listening to this webinar live on April 22nd, Happy Earth Day, or you're catching one of the replays in the next few weeks. Why now? Why during this crisis that the world is going through, why would you think about starting a podcast now? And I will tell you that a little bit of truth to this is, up until COVID-19, I had never done a webinar. Webinar was just not in my toolbox. But what I realized is that we have all, for the most part, bless the people who are on the front lines every day, whether they're schlepping groceries at the grocery store or on the front lines of an ER. Those people's lives changed very differently than ours. But for many of us, we have been given a gift. And the gift that we have been given is the gift of time. And whether it's a restructuring of how you work, whether it's your work looks different now than it did 2 months ago, whether you don't even have to commute or whatever it is, this gift of time has been presented to us now. So I realized as I shifted my podcast about 6 weeks ago or 6 episodes ago, that really what this is look, let's take a moment to capture this moment. And especially the clients that I have, the people that I talk to who are CEOs, business owners, thought leaders, they are some sort of C-suite person inside an organization, and they are thinking about starting that podcast for, it could be for their business, for their shop, for their small business, for their local business, whatever. It could be for their personal brand. They're a CEO, they're a business owner. So they want to tell this story. And my thing is, you need to build it now. Because I am an optimist and I do believe that the world is going to start spinning again. And when it starts spinning again, it's going to start spinning fast. History would show to us that that's how it works, right? History would show to us that throughout all the crises that we have faced in our time, as dark and as bleak as it seems, we always come through it. And we seem to come through it better. So I'm of the belief that this is no different. It's a little funky right now, yes. But if you take this time right now, and you create that professional and compelling podcast, then it's going to be published and it's going to be going when the world starts coming back. And one thing about a great podcast, especially in the business community, is there may be no more impactful business card than walking up to somebody at a party and they say, well, what do you do? Say, well, you should listen to my podcast. You'll learn all about what I do. That's a really powerful thing. And damn it, it feels good when you say it. So when I say why now, why are we doing webinars in the middle of this crisis? Because now is an amazing, amazing time to start a podcast. And if you stay until the end, one of the things, I am your podcast coach. Coaching makes a difference. And if you stay until the end, I'm going to show you how you and I can work together in a way that's meaningful, that will help you get your podcast launched fast with a whole lot of extras too. All right. So rules and roles. I like to start every meeting with an objective, an agenda, rules and roles. Agenda is simple. Watch the webinar. Your rules, be present. Don't take notes. You don't need to take notes. And here's why. At the end of this webinar, I am going to send you an email. And this email is going to have a bunch of free resources in it, and it's going to have a recap of this. So just sit back, drink your coffee, drink your water, your tea, your whiskey. It's 10 in the morning, whatever you need. Sit back, be present. You don't need to take notes because you're going to receive a recap at the end of this, and ask questions. And yes, this right now is a live webinar and you can ask questions at the Q&A on Zoom. But I want to give you my email address to ask questions. hello@yourpodcastcoach.com. The reason why I want to give you that is because it just goes without fail that the best question that you have is going to pop in your head 5 minutes after this webinar is over. So hello@yourpodcastcoach.com. It's an email that comes right to me. So I will be answering that email for you. So any questions that you have throughout this process, you can send it there. If you want to throw it in the chat or the Q&A or in Zoom, you can, but I want to make sure you have that, because if you get a question at 2 in the morning, you can send it there as well. So be present, ask questions, get ready. Let me tell you a little bit about who I am and where I come from, and how I might differ from other people who are trying to persuade you to start a podcast right now with their guru mentality. My background is radio. So audio storytelling has literally been what I've done my whole life. And I want to dive a little, I'm going to pull a layer back. Yes, I'm in radio, but just because I have a 25-year radio background does not necessarily equate to I can help you with your podcast. But the reason why I believe I can and am qualified to do so is that what I did specifically in the radio industry, other than just talking on the radio, was I was a talent coach. Now, what that means inside radio is that the radio personalities that you grew up listening to, that you had a relationship with, and we'll talk about the power of that relationship in a few minutes, but those personalities, they needed a coach. They needed somebody when they got off the radio and said, oh my gosh, my show, it was terrible today or it was great today. I was the person that went to them and said, hey, this was great. This is how you might do it better. So I've kind of built my whole career around what we're talking about today. And it's not even just a career thing like, oh, this is what I got to do. It's actually what I really enjoy doing. I really enjoy, and especially now, because in radio, it's a lot of radio personalities, it's news shows, talk shows, etc. But when you work across a wide variety of industries and you work with individuals, then the stories vary so incredibly. So the real cool thing for me personally is I get to help you tell your story, whether it's about a Eastern European accounting method, which about 4 years ago I helped an accountant do a podcast and a way of handling money that I never would have imagined, or a celebrity chef. And I've worked with a very famous celebrity chef on their podcast. So that's my radio background. I shifted to podcast about 2012. And then in 2014, I went full time into it because I believed it was the future. Yay, I got that right. And like I said, I've worked with artists, celebrity chefs, accountants, software engineers. I work with one of the largest software consultancies in New York City. I still work with radio people. And I figure if I did the number and I added it all up, I've probably either reviewed, coached, had some impact on probably 10,000 unique podcast episodes in the time that I've been doing this. And again, it's a real rewarding thing for me because I take all the stuff that I learned about audio storytelling, and now I apply those same principles to help you tell the story through audio that you want to tell. So back to the professional podcast. A professional podcast, think about the way you might listen to your favorite podcast, probably on your smartphone. So you whip out your smartphone and then you dial up Spotify or Apple Podcasts or Stitcher or iHeartRadio or one of those. You hit play. That's the common behavior of listening to podcasts. Now that I can help people create stories that live in the same space as the biggest names in podcasting, is very powerful. It's very rewarding. And I look forward to sharing this information with you right now. So let's just jump in and talk about the bad podcasts, because this still comes up. So if I go back to 2000, or let's say 2014, when I really started doing podcast consulting and podcast coaching full time, the survey that came out that year said that the two biggest complaints about podcasts were they were too long and they were too boring. Now, I tend to believe that those go hand in hand. If you don't know, if you don't have a good structure, if you don't really know what you're doing, or you haven't put a lot of thought into it and the practicing and preparation of your podcast, well, it might just go a bit too long, and thus it might be boring. But what's really fascinating about the bad podcasts, 2014, those were the two biggest complaints. Well, you fast forward 5 years, 2019, and I would say that there's more podcasts, they're better, but still the two top complaints is they're too long and they're too boring. However, the too long part, the average length of a podcast in 2014 was, I believe, around 48 minutes. And in 2019, it's about 44 minutes. So they have decreased about 5 minutes, but those complaints are still there. But that is not you. That's why you're here. That's why you're listening to this webinar. That's why you are staying present as I'm going through this information, because if you do certain things, if you avoid these common mistakes and you go through the secrets, which I'm about to share with you, then you're going to avoid being too long and you're going to avoid being too boring. And I'm going to talk in a moment where we talk about practice and preparation, what happens to over 40% of all podcasts that are launched. Over 40% don't have a good outcome. So let's jump into three big secrets. And I said at the very beginning, I want to bake in some of these mistakes that I see. And just to know that the email that you're going to receive upon watching this is going to include a podcast episode that is literally about mistakes. It's just like, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. As I said, I want to bake in those mistakes into things that you can apply and use and understand. And secret number one is that the tech is actually very easy, and it's also very inexpensive. It's the most common question when someone I'm talking to is, hey, I want to start a podcast, but I don't know what to buy. Can I use my phone? How does it show up on iTunes? I mean, it's the tech side of it. And for many people that are starting a podcast in that space, again, the CEOs, the professionals, these are very intelligent people, very smart people. But nobody ever said to them, hey, here's how you start a podcast by building a studio in your house that sounds like $1 million studio. I wouldn't expect them to know that, but they know everything there is to know about dentistry or marketing or whatever. So let's just throw this out there. The tech is very easy and it's inexpensive, because a mistake that I see too often is way too much energy and way too much time focused on the technology and what's happening. So I'm going to send you a studio checklist as part of this. So you're going to see some equipment. But here's what you need to know about the tech. You want to select the right equipment, because understanding how people listen to podcasts is very important. I listen, so on average, the average podcast consumer listens to 7.5 hours of podcast per week. Now, if you're like me, you've had days where you've listened to 7.5 hours, but again, it's an average. But the reality is that a lot of people that listen to podcasts tend to listen in an environment. It's a non-exclusive activity, so you can listen to a podcast while you garden or work out or take a walk or shop or whatever. And invariably what happens is you complete a podcast and then set up on your iPhone or your Android, it just goes right into the next podcast you might have downloaded or selected or subscribed to. So what happens when somebody's listening to a Joe Rogan? And I use Joe Rogan because he's the biggest name from a survey in podcasting, the most ubiquitous name. So they're listening to Joe Rogan, or you're listening to Joe Rogan, and then a podcast comes on that has an appreciable difference in quality, an appreciable drop in quality. So Joe Rogan, I don't know, $500,000, $1 million studio. He sounds good. Sounds great. Or in NPR or Adam Carolla or Russell Brand or whoever it is you're listening to, these big names, they've got the money, so they spent the money on the studio. Well, if the podcast suddenly goes and there's an appreciable decline in quality, well, before you even get your story out, the person has already tuned out, because they have an expectation that it's going to sound good. It's going to sound consistent. And if it does not sound consistent, well, then they're gone. So for all the work that you do to create this story, to tell your story, to share with the world what it is you want to share, if the quality sucks, they'll never get there. But the good news is that good quality matters, but it's not expensive. So don't be, if you watch a YouTube of Joe Rogan, you see his studio. It's very nice. It's very, very nice. He probably spent quite a bit of money on that. But you can spend $200. You can actually probably do it for less than that, but you can spend $200 and sound as good as the biggest names in podcasting. To be on a technical level playing field. That's what's important. Good quality matters so that you're on a technical level playing field. So when you're on that technical level playing field, then you don't need to worry about the tech anymore. It's done. The box has been checked. I can show you how to get this stuff done and set it up in about 5 minutes. Another free resource you're going to receive is my 5-minute studio setup that will show you that. What microphone to buy, what you need, what I don't recommend. And then the other thing you're going to see is the free, F-R-E-E, big word, the free software you can download to record onto. And then how, again, very easy, your podcast is published and shows up on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Because that's one of those things where I go back to what I said a moment ago. Very, very smart people. And I had this conversation last week with a guy that just started an amazing podcast, and professional, very smart, intelligent man, said, I think it's so cool that I hit publish, and then like 5 minutes later, I go on Apple Podcasts and there it is. And it's literally that simple. So I don't want you to stress about the tech. The tech is very, very easy. And like I said, a big mistake is somebody who spends a lot of that energy. It's not just time, it's energy. Oh my God, I don't know what microphone to buy or how's it going to, no, it's super easy. You're going to get a resource at the end of this that walks you through it. You're going to get a checklist where you can order stuff. And there's other ways to do it. I can show you my ways, and my technical, and I'm not a technical person, But what I learned is because I was in radio, I had access to broadcast radio engineers, the people who were responsible for building $1 million studios. These were the people that I consulted way back in 2012, 2013, on building a podcast studio in my home that sounded technically as good as a radio studio, or as good, in this case, the biggest names in podcasting. Good quality matters. You want to make that investment. So, secret number 2, and I'm going to take a sip of my coffee before I do this one. So, once you're at a technical level playing field, now you need to say things that sound good. So, you technically sound good, but now you want to sound like a pro. And when I say this, it's about hosting, it's about interviewing, it's about the physical act of speaking. That you are now talking into a microphone, no different than I'm doing with this webinar, because I have this hooked up to my home studio. But here's what I want you to do. This is where people don't focus energy, and where I believe you should focus energy. This one thing, and it's one thing, but it's actually 2 things: preparation and practicing. This is where you need to focus your energy. The preparation of your podcast and practicing. So, a couple of things that I'm going to share with you around this secret. Let's see. What do I want to go with first? Let's first of all talk about the other gurus. Now, what I believe about starting a podcast is that, one, you could plug in the equipment and you can start talking, and that can be fine for you. But many people consult who they believe is a professional on starting a podcast. It's just like, it's an investment of time, it's an investment in energy. Having a coach, having a resource to help you goes a long way. It's an investment in yourself, and it goes a long way. Well, there are other gurus that you might have seen in your Facebook feed or on Google Ads that will tell you how to start a podcast. But there's a consistent thing that I have seen amongst many of them, is they spend a lot of their time telling you what equipment to buy, what microphones to buy, and how to set it up. And then they will say something like, hit record and just go. Just speak. My favorite is, just start talking and it will come. That's how people make bad podcasts. If you focus the energy on this, the practice and the preparation, long before you hit record and start trying to publish, when the time comes to publish, you're going to sound great. You're going to sound fantastic. You are going to sound like a pro because you've had the preparation and you've had the practice. The other statistic, which I mentioned a few minutes ago, which is very important, is that over 40% of all the podcasts in Apple Podcasts, and if you don't know Apple Podcast, which is a permanent fixture on an iPhone, which is one of the reasons why podcasts really started to take off, because it became a permanent fixture in 2012. Over 40% of the podcasts on Apple Podcast have not been updated in over a year. So what does that mean? That means that over 40% of the people that started a podcast got about 4 episodes in and ran out of things to talk about. That's the preparation part. If you think about that beforehand, I always recommend you lay out your first 10, 15 episodes. See that path forward. When you prepare, you don't pod fade. And that's an actual term when you start a podcast and then fade away. And on average, I think it's 4 episodes. But that's the thing, is if you just start talking and go, well, I'm going to record my first episode and this guru told me that it will come and it's just going to come. No, you get 4 episodes in and you're like, man, I ran out of things to say. So I'm just going to go start a blog. So preparation and practice. What is my episode going to sound like? Now that's the structure of it. I mean, are you going to tell a story at the beginning? Are you going to have an introduction that sets up your podcast? Are you going to have an introduction every episode that sets up that episode? This is the type of structure that I work with you on. Average length of podcast, as I said earlier, right now is about 44 minutes. That's probably too long. I would say that is too long unless you are just a masterful storyteller or you are interviewing, a huge name. really you could keep it around 20 minutes. And actually the truth of the matter is the perfect length of a podcast is not 1 second longer than it should be, or not 1 second longer than it needs to be. And what I mean by that is don't spend 20 minutes talking about something that you could talk about in 30 seconds. So when you think about your structure, what are you going to say at the very, very beginning? What are you going to say at the very, very beginning that's going to hook people in? Audio, storytelling, fundamentals. Say something in the first 60 seconds that grabs somebody's attention and says, "Oh, I need to know what's going to happen. I need to know. I need to listen to this all the way through to hear how this is going to end." Saying things like, "By the end of this episode, you will blank." So when you think about the structure of your episode, that's a great place to put your energy. What kind of episodes are you going to do? Are you going to do interviews? You're going to just tell stories? There's not necessarily a wrong answer. You just want to choose what is right for you. The mistake people make is they hit record, they assume it will come, they start talking, they talk too long, they make a bad podcast, and then they get discouraged because they run out of ideas. This could be handled by preparation, planning your episodes, planning what you're going to talk about. All that. It's just, again, I mean, you can sit down with a legal pad and write this out. This is an area where I do spend a lot of my time coaching people is this. Just think about what you want. Map these episodes out. Map out, are you going to do it every week? Are you going to do seasons? Those are the type of questions you want to answer. And then the last thing I put here is practice, 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 practice. Now, this is the part where I'm very fortunate because I do get to work with CEOs and business professionals and again, very smart people, intelligent people. But something happens when you put a microphone in front of somebody, you tell them to speak about something, and then you tell them to listen back to the sound of their own voice. There is a commonality amongst all of us where the sound of our own voice makes us cringe. We'd rather see ourselves doing some sort of TikTok video than the sound of our own voice. Now, it's a hurdle. It's a very common hurdle. Again, highly professional individuals don't want to sit there and record because of a fear around the sound of their own voice. And the way to overcome that is when you get that awesome equipment set up on your computer, just practice. Go in. What I recommend is when you have your studio set up, go in, you'll see the free software. It's called Audacity. You hit record and just imagine that you're in the middle of your podcast episode and just start talking. Start talking about what it is you want to talk about. Just let it go. Make it a very free-flowing experience. Talk for like 30, 45 seconds. There's going to be two things that happen here. Number one, you're going to say something that allows you to hear your voice, thus getting over the sound of your own voice. But two, ideas are going to come out. So it serves two purposes. But by practicing it, you get comfortable. And I cannot stress the importance of that enough. Long before you ever publish or long before you ever interview anyone, you just want to get comfortable with this. What is recording a podcast? Not to freak you out, but it's standing in a room talking to yourself, which is in many ways what I'm physically doing right now. I'm alone in a room talking to myself. I know I'm talking to everybody on the webinar, but the reality is when you record a podcast, you are recording something that if you do it right is timeless. You are recording something that people will listen to later. But at the end of the day, you are in a room talking to yourself. So the more that you practice, the more that you get that comfort. Then when the time comes, because you've done the preparation, when the time comes to tell that story, it's going to flow. That's that sweet spot for me. Getting you comfortable so that when you feel so good about you documenting whatever, your family story, your business story, whatever, you document that and you sound amazing doing it. And physically practicing talking into your microphone is what's going to help you with that. All right, secret number 3. Now, I've given you some good information. I don't want you to make mistakes spending too much time and energy on tech. I want you to spend time and energy about thinking about what you want to talk about and practicing and getting over the sound of your own voice. But this secret When you understand why people love podcasts, and then you do this, you're going to have an amazing podcast. I mean, it's the truth. If you understand the principle that I'm about to share with you, like this is one of those things where if you don't open the email that I'm going to send to you at the end of this, and you don't look at any of the resources, and you forget the name Michael Sharkey, and you forget your podcast coach, and you go on your merry way and you start a podcast 3 months from now, remember this one thing about why people love podcasts. Because a great podcast, you will only ever speak to one person. What? Why does that matter? What does that mean? For all of my years in radio, for all the thousands of episodes that I've reviewed, the hundreds of episodes that I have personally recorded for my own podcasts, one thing is true. When you, in recording a podcast or on the radio, speak only to one person, and you build that connection with one person, you are building something so strong that people will talk about podcasts. They will talk about things as far as the audio that they're consuming in a way that it's not like, yeah, it was pretty cool. They talk about podcasts like it changes their life. And what that's doing when you talk to one person, and I'm going to dive deeper into this, don't worry, but it's building a bond. It's building a very strong, intimate bond with your listener. Talking to one person is that realizing when you record a podcast, you have an image in your mind of a person, and that's the person you're talking to. You will never, ever, ever, ever say, hey, all y'all. You will never say, hey, everybody in podcast land. Think about how that makes you feel. Think about, and I will turn this on you. Think of your favorite podcast. Think of the host, the way she or he speaks when they speak to you. You feel as if taking a walk, you've got AirPods in your ear, you've got earbuds in your ear. You're taking a walk and you're listening to your favorite podcast, and the host says something and you're like, man, she just said that to me. It is as if she wrote that piece of content for me and me alone. That's the intimacy of podcasting. It's a connection that's extraordinarily powerful, and it comes from the host's ability to understand that they are only ever talking to one person, ever. And that's understanding your audience, who you're talking to every single time. Now, we can, as we work together, dive into the differences between different audiences and how you handle different episodes and things like that. And that's next level. But I want you to understand this basic principle. You only ever talk to one person. So I was saying a moment ago that podcasts are powerful in a way that is, way more impactful than a YouTube video. And I'm not dissing videos or blogs or anything. I think a podcast can be part of a great overall content creation strategy. But when you understand what the role of a great podcast is, then you understand what the power it has. Thanksgiving 3 years ago, just like you probably do this too, is that right before you eat a big meal or right before whatever, you go around the table and you give thanks. And my best friend's wife at Thanksgiving 3 years ago, we're all saying, thanks for our family and thanks to our abundance and all this stuff. And she said, I have to give thanks this year to my discovery of podcasts. Now that resonated with me because I was like, that's cool. But she was very adamant about how podcast had transformed her life and how she spoke about the hosts or the podcast that she listened to. And she didn't speak about like, yeah, that was really cool. I learned a tip on something. No, it was, I learned something from, I believe she mentioned Brooke Castillo. Brooke Castillo does a Life Coach School podcast. It's a fantastic podcast. She's a great host. She understands that talking to one person is a very impactful thing. And she was like, Brooke helped me through dark times. It's like it's her best friend. So understand that connection, regardless of your content. If the goal is to create a professional podcast that other people are going to want to listen to, then understand the impact and what's happening with the other people that are listening, because you only speak to one person ever. It's a case study that I like to talk about is the podcast Serial. Now, if you have not heard of Serial, if you've not ever listened to it, I recommend it. It's a very good podcast. But the reason why I bring up Serial is pretty ubiquitous. People all over have heard of Serial. Serial came out in the fall of 2014, came out from NPR. And basically, it is a true crime podcast. Like many of the podcasts on NPR, it tells a story. It tells a story of a 17-year-old in Baltimore who was convicted of murdering his girlfriend. It's now he's 31, he's in jail. So the question of the podcast is, did he do it? So on the surface, it's a compelling podcast. I want to know if he did it. But when you peel back the layer of Serial, you start to understand that there's something else going on. Sarah Koenig is the host of Serial, and I got to see her speak in 2015, and she talked about, what it meant to make Serial and all that sort of thing. And she talked about as they recorded Serial from episode 1 to the very end, they had no idea how it was going to end. And it's a story that's still unfolding today. But here is what's really going on with Serial. As a listener, you listen. You too are captivated by whether or not you think he did it. But what really captivates you, and what Sarah Koenig did an amazing job doing, is she made you care about whether or not you think, as the listener, Sarah thinks that he did it. You're on a journey with Sarah Koenig. You want to learn whether or not you think she thinks he did it. Some episodes, she thinks he's innocent. Some episodes, she thinks he's guilty. But it's a journey that she takes you on because she understands that she's only talking to you. And it is as if, even though Serial has been downloaded like 100 million times, as if she wrote that story for you in that moment and only for you. So if you understand that you're only ever talking to one person, you will create an incredibly compelling podcast. So quick review. Bad podcasts are everywhere, but we've established that that is not you, that the tech is easy. Don't sweat it. You're going to have the information in your inbox later today that's going to help you build a professional studio, links, everything that you need, preparation and practice. That's where your focus should be. When you get off this webinar today and you're thinking about your podcast, write down everything. Write down, and I'm not kidding you, write down what you think your episodes might sound like, what's the name of your podcast, all these things, write it all down, make it a big notepad, and then start talking to yourself out loud. If you're like all of us in some level of quarantine right now, you might seem a bit silly to your other family members, but damn it, start talking to yourself, because that's the kind of practicing. And never forget that you are speaking to one person, that when you do this, you build an incredibly powerful, intimate bond with the listener. When you do that, they will be your listeners and they will talk to you. Your listeners will speak to you the same way I just said. It is as if you created that content just for them. Now, as I've said, as a coach, I work with a lot of professionals. And what I have learned in all my conversations, especially with people that up until the last 2 months were time starved and busy and trying to figure out how they were going to do this, is that having a coach helps. And because it's something that really fuels me, because it fuels me to get out of bed and help you tell your story, that the coaching realm, the one-on-one coaching realm, is something where it sort of spans everything. Like my clients, I have literally been their accountable champion. I have been the person that, did you send me the audio? Are we going to meet today? That type of coaching, that type of relationship. And then when we do speak, it's a coaching relationship. When we do speak, when I'm asking you to tell your story, when I am asking you in your very first episode to give me a reason why, as a listener, I want to listen to more episodes of this podcast, it requires a sense of vulnerability. It requires you digging a little deeper. Even if your podcast, you own a furniture store and your podcast is going to be about your furniture store, I am more likely to do business with you if I understand who you are. More people buy from people that they know or trust. And if you do this right, you will build that trust almost immediately. So working as a coach, that's what I work on. So I ask you, how would you like help with this? Because I'm down. I would love to help you with it. So